Islam is one of the world's most influential religions, with over 1 billion followers worldwide. Its teachings and practices have shaped societies and cultures for centuries, offering spiritual guidance, moral frameworks, and political systems. Yet, like all major religions, Islam invites scrutiny. How much of its origin story is rooted in history and how much is constructed through theology and cultural influences? The Quran claims to be the literal word of God revealed to Muhammad over 23 years. It is said to be a perfect and unaltered guide for humanity. The Hadith, or sayings and actions of Muhammad, further illuminate Islamic teachings and provide guidance on everything from daily life to state governance. Together, these texts form the foundation of a religion that governs not only spiritual matters but also social, legal, and political aspects of life. But what if these foundations are not as solid as they appear? What if the Quran is not a divine revelation but a compilation of pre-existing ideas shaped by the cultural and religious environment of 7th century Arabia? What if the Hadith are less reliable records of Muhammad's life and more a reflection of political and sectarian agendas? The emergence of Islam in the 7th century CE cannot be fully understood without examining the historical, cultural, and religious environment of pre-Islamic Arabia. This context provides essential clues about the factors that shaped the formation of Islamic teachings and the early Muslim community. Before Islam, Arabia was a region marked by tribalism, polytheism, and trade. The Arabian Peninsula's harsh desert environment fostered a deeply tribal society where loyalty to one's clan or tribe was paramount. This tribal structure influenced social norms, governance, and religious practices. Pre-Islamic Arabia was predominantly polytheistic, with each tribe worshipping its own deities. The Kaaba in Mecca housed idols representing various gods, making it a central site for pilgrimage. While polytheism dominated, there were also monotheistic influences. Jewish and Christian communities existed in parts of Arabia, especially in Yemen and along trade routes. Zoroastrianism, practiced in the neighboring Sasanian Empire, introduced dualistic concepts of good and evil. Mecca, as a key trading hub, exposed the Quraysh tribe to a variety of cultures and religious ideas. Caravans brought goods and stories from Persia, Byzantium, and beyond. This exchange of goods and ideas created a fertile environment for new religious concepts to take root. The Arabian Peninsula was a region of political fragmentation with no centralized authority. This lack of unity created a vacuum that Islam would later seek to fill. Intertribal warfare was common, often fueled by disputes over resources or honor. Alliances shifted frequently and blood feuds could last generations. These rivalries underscored the need for a unifying ideology, which Islam would later provide. Arabia was bordered by two major powers, the Byzantine Empire to the northwest and the Sasanian Empire to the northeast. Both empires sought to extend their influence into Arabia, often using local tribes as proxies. The religious conflicts between these empires, Christianity in Byzantium and Zoroastrianism in Persia, introduced theological debates that influenced Arabian thought. Muhammad was born into this complex world around 570 CE in Mecca, a city dominated by the Quraysh tribe. Orphaned at a young age, he grew up under the care of his uncle Abu Talib and became a merchant involved in long-distance trade. As a trader, Muhammad likely encountered Jewish, Christian, and Zoroastrian communities, absorbing their stories and theological concepts. These encounters may have influenced his later teachings, which incorporate elements from these traditions. Muhammad was not the first to challenge polytheism in Arabia. The Hanifs were a group of monotheistic seekers who rejected idol worship and sought a purer form of worship. Muhammad's emphasis on monotheism aligns with this pre-existing movement, suggesting a continuity rather than a sudden break. The Quran contains numerous references to biblical figures and narratives, such as Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. These stories often parallel their counterparts in Jewish and Christian texts, but are reinterpreted to fit the Quran's theological framework. For example, Jesus is portrayed as a prophet rather than the Son of God, reflecting Islamic monotheism while engaging with Christian narratives. Concepts such as the final judgment, heaven and hell, and angelic beings echo Zoroastrian beliefs. The dualistic struggle between good and evil in Zoroastrianism may have influenced the Quranic portrayal of Allah's opposition to Satan. Islamic practices such as pilgrimage or Hajj, fasting, and communal prayer draw on pre-Islamic Arabian rituals. The redefinition of the Kaaba as a monotheistic site illustrates how Islam adapted existing traditions to serve its theological goals. The Quran's emphasis on social justice, tribal unity, and monotheism addressed the pressing concerns of 7th century Arabia. Pre-Islamic Arabia had stark divisions between wealthy merchants and impoverished tribespeople. The Quran's call for charity and fairness appealed to marginalized groups. By declaring all Muslims part of a single ummah community, Islam transcended tribal divisions, creating a sense of shared identity. The rejection of polytheism and the emphasis on Allah as the sole deity helped unify diverse tribes under a common religious framework. The historical context of Islam's emergence reveals that it did not arise in isolation, but was deeply influenced by the religious and cultural environment of 7th century Arabia. Understanding these influences helps explain the origins of Islamic teachings and their enduring appeal. The Quran is the central text of Islam, regarded by Muslims as the literal word of God, revealed to Muhammad over 23 years. Its verses, known as ayat, are said to contain divine wisdom and guidance for all aspects of life. However, critical analysis raises important questions about its origins, compilation, and content. Is the Quran a divine revelation as it claims, or is it a human construct shaped by the cultural and historical context of 7th century Arabia? The Quran was not compiled into its current form during Muhammad's lifetime, but was preserved through oral recitation and scattered written fragments. This process raises questions about its consistency and authenticity. Muhammad's followers memorized the Quran, and many verses were recited during prayers and communal gatherings. Oral transmission, while effective in preserving content, is susceptible to variations and errors over time. Verses of the Quran were written on materials like parchment, bones, and palm leaves. These fragments were scattered and lacked a standardized format. After Muhammad's death, there was concern that portions of the Quran might be lost as the original reciters began to die in battle. The third Caliph, Uthman, ordered a standardized compilation of the Quran to prevent discrepancies. Variants of the Quran were collected and destroyed, leaving only the Uthmanic version. This raises questions about what was excluded and whether the process truly preserved the original message. The Quran shares numerous themes, narratives, and teachings with earlier religious texts, particularly the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament. Stories of Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and Jesus appear in the Quran, often with significant variations. For example, the story of Adam and Eve parallels Genesis, but introduces a dialogue between Allah and Iblis, Satan, emphasizing obedience. The narrative of Moses and Pharaoh echoes Exodus, but includes unique details about Pharaoh's repentance. These parallels suggest that the Quran drew upon existing traditions, reinterpreting them for an Arabian audience. The Quran acknowledges Jesus as a prophet and Mary as his virgin mother, reflecting Christian influence. However, it denies the divinity of Jesus and the concept of the Trinity, reshaping Christian doctrines to fit Islamic monotheism. Concepts such as heaven and hell, angels, and the final judgment align with Zoroastrian eschatology. Pre-Islamic Arabian practices, such as pilgrimage to the Kaaba, were redefined within an Islamic framework. The Quran frequently repeats themes of monotheism, obedience, and the consequences of disbelief. Critics argue that this repetition reflects the oral nature of the text, designed for recitation rather than literary coherence. Muslims often point to the Quran's linguistic beauty as evidence of its divine origin. While the Quran's Arabic is considered eloquent, it also includes ambiguous verses, grammatical inconsistencies, and variant readings. Some verses in the Quran appear to contradict each other, leading to the doctrine of abrogation, naskh, where later verses supersede earlier ones. This raises questions about the Quran's claim of perfection and consistency. The Quran is often praised for its supposed scientific foreknowledge, with verses interpreted as predicting modern discoveries. However, these claims are highly contested. Verses about embryology, for example, Quran 23:14, are interpreted as describing the stages of fetal development. References to the expansion of the universe, for example, Quran 51:47, are seen as aligning with modern cosmology. The problem with these interpretations is that they rely on vague language and retrofitting modern knowledge onto ancient texts. Some scientific claims in the Quran, such as the setting of the sun in a muddy spring, Quran 18:86, contradict observable reality. Many verses are metaphorical rather than literal, allowing for flexible interpretations. This flexibility raises questions about whether the Quran contains actual scientific knowledge or is being adapted to fit contemporary understanding. The Quran addresses specific social, legal, and political issues of 7th century Arabia, such as tribal warfare, inheritance, and marriage. These contextual responses suggest that the Quran was shaped by the needs and challenges of its time. Some revelations even conveniently align with Muhammad's personal circumstances, such as his marriage to Zainab, Quran 33:37. This raises questions about whether certain verses were divinely inspired or politically motivated. Practices such as fasting, pilgrimage, and circumambulation of the Kaaba predate Islam and were redefined within an Islamic context. The adaptation of these traditions illustrates the Quran's continuity with its cultural environment. The Quran, whether viewed as divine or human in origin, reflects the complex interplay of religious, cultural, and historical influences in 7th century Arabia. Its narratives, themes, and practices are deeply rooted in pre-existing traditions, reinterpreted to create a cohesive theological framework. While it remains a powerful spiritual text, critical analysis reveals a text shaped by human agency as much as by claims of divine intervention. The Hadith, a collection of sayings and actions attributed to Muhammad, is a cornerstone of Islamic theology and practice. Alongside the Quran, the Hadith forms the basis of Sharia law and guides the daily lives of Muslims worldwide. However, the authenticity of these reports has been a subject of intense scrutiny, even within the Islamic tradition. Questions arise about the collection process, the reliability of transmission, and the extent to which political and sectarian agendas influence the Hadith corpus. The Quran provides general principles, but the Hadith offers specific guidance on rituals, ethics, and legal matters. Examples include detailed instructions for prayer, fasting, and pilgrimage, which are not fully outlined in the Quran. The Sunnah, or practices of Muhammad, is derived from the Hadith and serves as a model for Muslim behavior. The Hadith provides insight into Muhammad's character and decision-making, reinforcing his role as a moral and spiritual leader. Islamic law relies heavily on the Hadith to interpret the Quran and address issues not explicitly mentioned in the text. Without the Hadith, many aspects of Islamic law would be incomplete or ambiguous. The process of compiling Hadith was complex and fraught with challenges. Unlike the Quran, which was standardized relatively early, the Hadith emerged over centuries. During Muhammad's lifetime, his companions memorized and orally transmitted his sayings and actions. Oral transmission, while common in ancient cultures, is prone to inaccuracies, embellishments, and omissions. Hadith were not systematically recorded until over a century after Muhammad's death. Early scholars like Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim sifted through thousands of reports, rejecting many as unreliable. Each hadith includes a chain of narrators tracing back to Muhammad. The reliability of these narrators is crucial to the authenticity of the report. Scholars developed criteria to evaluate narrators, such as their memory, character, and reputation. Despite efforts to verify hadith, the collection process raises several issues that cast doubt on their reliability. Political and sectarian conflicts in early Islam led to the fabrication of hadith to support specific agendas. For example, the Sunni-Shia divide resulted in competing hadith collections that reflect differing theological priorities. Rulers often commissioned favorable hadith to legitimize their authority. Many hadith contradict one another, leading to confusion and debate among scholars. Examples include conflicting reports about prayer times, dietary restrictions, and marital practices. The sheer number of hadith, ranging in the hundreds of thousands, makes it difficult to determine which are authentic. Even reputable collections like Bukhari's Sahih contain repetitions and variations of the same sayings. The earliest written compilations appeared over 100 years after Muhammad's death, leaving ample time for distortions. Many hadith seem to reflect the socio-political concerns of later generations rather than the actual teachings of Muhammad. Studies on oral traditions show that memory is fallible, especially over multiple generations. The reliability of narrators, no matter how well-intentioned, is inherently limited. Even within Islamic scholarship, debates exist about the trustworthiness of certain narrators. Some narrators were accused of fabricating hadith for personal gain or to align with political ideologies. Hadith form the backbone of Sharia, influencing legal rulings on marriage, inheritance, and criminal justice. However, reliance on potentially fabricated hadith undermines the legitimacy of these laws. Practices such as prayer and fasting are deeply influenced by hadith. Variations in hadith collections have led to differing interpretations and practices among Islamic sects. Hadith have shaped gender roles, societal norms, and ethical guidelines in Islamic societies. Critics highlight hadith that appear to justify controversial practices, such as child marriage or gender segregation. Some modern Muslim thinkers advocate for a return to Quran-only Islam, Quranism, rejecting the hadith as unreliable. Reformists argue that reliance on hadith has led to legalism and misinterpretation of Islamic principles. Traditional scholars maintain that rigorous authentication methods validate the core body of hadith. They argue that dismissing the hadith undermines centuries of Islamic scholarship and practice. Modern scholars emphasize the importance of understanding the historical and cultural context of hadith. Some hadith may have been context-specific rather than universally applicable. The hadith are indispensable to Islamic theology and practice, but their authenticity and reliability remain contentious. The collection process, the potential for fabrication, and the reliance on oral transmission raise critical questions about their role in shaping Islam. Understanding the origins and limitations of the hadith is essential for anyone seeking to examine Islam's foundations critically. At the heart of Islam are its theological claims about the nature of God, the prophethood of Muhammad, and its eschatological vision of the afterlife. These beliefs are central to Muslim identity and practice, but they also invite critical examination. How do these claims align with reason, historical evidence, and other religious traditions? Islam emphasizes the oneness of God, or Tawheed, declaring Allah as the sole creator, sustainer, and judge of the universe. The Quran describes Allah with attributes of mercy, omnipotence, and omniscience. But is the concept of an all-powerful, all-knowing deity consistent with human experiences of suffering and injustice? If Allah is merciful, why do innocents suffer? If Allah is all-knowing, how does human free will operate? The Quran occasionally describes Allah with human-like attributes such as hands and a face. These descriptions conflict with the Islamic prohibition against associating Allah with human forms. Islamic theologians have debated whether these descriptions are metaphorical or literal. Allah is portrayed as both merciful and wrathful, rewarding the faithful and punishing disbelievers. The Quran's emphasis on punishment, eternal hellfire for disbelief, undermines the claim of divine mercy. How does a compassionate God justify eternal torment for finite sins? Muhammad is regarded as the seal of the prophets, the final and most perfect messenger of God. Traditional Islam views Muhammad as an exemplary human being whose actions are a model for all Muslims. However, historical accounts of Muhammad's life include actions that critics find morally problematic. His marriage to Aisha, reportedly consummated when she was 9 years old. His role in the execution of the men of the Banu Qurayza tribe and the enslavement of their women and children. How do these actions align with the claim of moral perfection? Certain Quranic revelations appear to address Muhammad's personal situations, raising questions about their divine origin. For instance, Quran 33:37 permits Muhammad to marry Zainab, the wife of his adopted son, after she divorced him. Such verses suggest Muhammad used revelation to justify personal decisions. Can revelations tied to specific circumstances be considered universally applicable? Like prophets in Judaism and Christianity, Muhammad's life includes both divine missions and human flaws. However, the lack of external corroboration for Muhammad's prophetic claims distinguishes him from figures like Moses and Jesus, whose stories are supported by multiple traditions. Islam teaches that all humans will be resurrected and judged by Allah based on their deeds. Those who believe and perform righteous acts are promised eternal paradise, while disbelievers face eternal punishment in hell. Critics question the justice of eternal damnation for disbelief. particularly for those who have never encountered Islam or were raised in other traditions. Is belief alone a fair criterion for salvation? The Quran offers vivid descriptions of paradise and hell. Paradise is depicted as a lush garden with rivers, reclining couches, and perpetual bliss. Hell is portrayed as a place of fire, boiling water, and unending torment. These depictions raise questions about their literal or metaphorical interpretation. Are these descriptions meant to convey spiritual truths or physical realities? The Quran affirms that Allah has predetermined the fate of every individual. This raises theological dilemmas about human free will and accountability. If Allah predestines disbelief, how can individuals be held responsible for their actions? The Quran repeatedly emphasizes Allah's mercy while also describing severe punishments for disobedience. How can Allah's mercy and justice coexist without contradiction? Some Quranic verses and hadith appear to conflict with contemporary ethical standards, such as the permissibility of slavery and concubinage, and the treatment of women in inheritance and testimony. How can these teachings be reconciled with claims of universal moral truth? Islam's claim to be the final and complete revelation excludes other religions from salvation. This exclusivity conflicts with the idea of a just and compassionate God, who would offer equal opportunities for salvation to all humanity. Some Quranic verses are interpreted as aligning with modern science, but others conflict with contemporary knowledge. For example, Quran 18:86 describes the sun setting in a muddy spring, which contradicts astronomical understanding. Critics question whether these verses reflect divine knowledge or the scientific understanding of Muhammad's time. The similarities between Islamic, Jewish, and Christian theologies suggest shared origins rather than unique revelations. How does Islam differentiate itself as the final and ultimate truth? Modern reformists within Islam seek to reinterpret or contextualize theological claims to align with contemporary values. This raises questions about the immutability of divine revelation. Islamic theology presents profound claims about God, prophethood, and the afterlife that have shaped the faith and its followers for centuries. However, these claims invite critical examination, particularly in light of ethical, philosophical, and historical questions. Scrutinizing these doctrines does not diminish their significance, but instead fosters a deeper understanding of their origins and implications. Islamic tradition presents a cohesive narrative of its origins. Muhammad received revelations from Allah in the early 7th century, which were later compiled into the Quran. These teachings formed the foundation of a unified religious and political system that quickly expanded across the Arabian Peninsula and beyond. However, critical historical analysis reveals inconsistencies and gaps in this narrative, suggesting that Islam's development may have been more complex and gradual than traditionally believed. According to Islamic tradition, Muhammad received his first revelation in 610 CE in Mecca. Over 23 years, these revelations address social, spiritual, and legal matters, culminating in a complete religious system. Following his death in 632 CE, his followers rapidly expanded Islamic rule, uniting disparate tribes under a shared religious framework. Some historians argue that Islam did not emerge fully formed during Muhammad's lifetime, but evolved over several decades or centuries. Evidence from archaeology, early manuscripts, and historical records challenges the timeline and details of the traditional narrative. The Quran identifies Mecca as a significant religious and commercial center, but historical evidence for its pre-Islamic prominence is sparse. Early Islamic sources describe Mecca as a bustling trade hub, yet archaeological findings do not support this depiction. Mecca's centrality in Islamic tradition may have been retroactively elevated to align with religious narratives. The Kaaba is portrayed as a monotheistic site established by Abraham and Ishmael. However, pre-Islamic Arabian sources describe the Kaaba as a polytheistic shrine housing idols of multiple deities. The transformation of the Kaaba into a monotheistic symbol aligns with Islam's theological emphasis on Tawhid. Was the Kaaba's association with Abraham a historical reality or a narrative construction? Early Islamic coins and inscriptions often lack references to Muhammad, the Quran, or Islamic symbols, suggesting a more gradual emergence of Islamic identity. For example, coins minted under early caliphs feature Christian and Zoroastrian imagery, indicating religious and cultural syncretism. The absence of explicitly Islamic iconography raises questions about the early development of Islamic theology. Contemporary non-Muslim sources from the 7th and 8th centuries provide limited and sometimes conflicting accounts of Islam's origins. These records often describe early Muslims as a sect of Judaism or Christianity rather than a distinct religious community. The evolving portrayal of Islam in external sources suggests that its identity crystallized over time. Early Quranic manuscripts show variations in text, challenging the claim of a perfectly preserved revelation. The Uthmanic recension standardized the Quran, but what happened to the earlier versions? Reports of companion codices, such as those of Ibn Mas'ud and Ubay ibn Ka'b, suggest that multiple versions of the Quran existed before Uthman's intervention. These discrepancies raise questions about the Quran's origins and its claim of divine perfection. The Quran was initially preserved through oral transmission, a method prone to variation and adaptation. The transition from oral to written form may have introduced changes, intentional or otherwise, reflecting the needs and priorities of early Muslim communities. The rapid expansion of Islamic rule under the Rashidun and Umayyad caliphates was as much political as religious. The integration of conquered peoples and cultures required the adaptation of Islamic teachings to diverse contexts. Did the early caliphs shape Islamic theology to consolidate their political authority? The Sunni-Shia split reflects competing narratives about early Islamic history and leadership. These divisions highlight the role of political and social dynamics in shaping Islamic doctrine. How much of early Islamic theology was influenced by these power struggles? Many aspects of Islam, from its rituals to its cosmology, align with pre-Islamic Arabian and Near Eastern traditions. Examples include the practice of fasting and pilgrimage, and concepts of divine judgment, angels and Satan, which echo Zoroastrian and Jewish ideas. This continuity suggests that Islam integrated existing traditions rather than introducing entirely new concepts. The blending of Jewish, Christian and Arabian traditions in early Islamic teachings reflects the multicultural environment of the Arabian Peninsula. How did this syncretism influence the development of Islam as a distinct religious identity? Islamic historians, writing centuries after Muhammad's death, sought to create a cohesive narrative of Islam's origins. These accounts often harmonize conflicting reports and elevate Muhammad's role as a prophet and leader. This retrospective construction reflects theological and political agendas rather than historical accuracy. The early Muslim community needed a unifying narrative to establish its identity and legitimacy. The elevation of Mecca, the standardization of the Quran, and the emphasis on Muhammad's prophetic mission served this purpose. The historical inconsistencies and revisionism surrounding Islam's origins suggest that its development was more gradual and complex than the traditional narrative implies. By examining archaeological evidence, textual variations, and the influence of pre-Islamic traditions, we gain a deeper understanding of how Islam evolved over time. This perspective invites further inquiry into the interplay between history, theology, and politics in shaping religious traditions. Islam provides a comprehensive ethical framework that governs personal behavior, societal norms, and legal systems. These teachings, derived from the Quran and Hadith, address issues such as gender roles, the treatment of non-Muslims, and moral conduct. While many Muslims view these principles as divinely inspired and timeless, critics argue that some teachings reflect the cultural and historical context of 7th century Arabia, raising questions about their universality and relevance in the modern world. The Quran acknowledges the spiritual equality of men and women, but also contains verses that reinforce gender inequality. Men are permitted to marry up to 4 wives, while women are limited to 1 husband. The testimony of a woman is worth half that of a man in financial matters. Daughters inherit half the share of sons. Supporters argue these rules reflect the context of 7th century Arabia, where women had limited rights, and that they improved women's status for the time. Islamic law permits practices like child marriage, with Aisha's marriage to Muhammad often cited as an example. Critics view this as problematic by modern ethical standards. Divorce laws favor men, allowing them to unilaterally divorce their wives, talaq, whereas women face more restrictions. The Quran encourages modesty for both men and women, but cultural interpretations have often placed greater emphasis on women. Practices such as veiling, hijab, niqab, burqa, are seen by some as empowering and by others as tools of oppression. Non-Muslims living under Islamic rule are granted dhimmi status, offering protection in exchange for the jizya tax. While this system allowed religious minorities to coexist with Muslims, it institutionalized unequal treatment, limiting their rights and requiring subservience. This reflects a hierarchical view of society that conflicts with modern principles of equality. Islam encourages the conversion of non-Muslims and views apostasy, leaving Islam, as a punishable offense, often by death, according to traditional interpretations of hadith. These teachings raise concerns about religious freedom and human rights. Verses in the Quran and hadith reflect varying attitudes toward non-believers. Peaceful coexistence, as in there is no compulsion in religion, and hostility in certain contexts, like kill the polytheists wherever you find them. These contradictions allow for selective interpretation, influencing how Muslims interact with non-Muslims. The Quran and Hadith acknowledge and regulate slavery, permitting practices like concubinage. While Islam encourages the freeing of slaves as a virtuous act, it does not explicitly prohibit slavery. Critics highlight this as evidence that Islamic ethics were shaped by the norms of 7th century Arabia. Islamic law prescribes severe punishments for certain crimes, including amputation for theft and flogging for adultery. Supporters argue that these punishments deter crime and uphold justice, while critics view them as excessively harsh and incompatible with modern human rights standards. Traditional interpretations of Islam emphasize distinct roles for men and women, often restricting women's participation in public life. These roles reflect patriarchal values rather than universal ethical principles. Modern reformists seek to reinterpret Islamic teachings in light of contemporary values, emphasizing principles of justice, equality, and compassion. How can Islamic principles adapt to modern ethical challenges without losing their theological foundations? The social and ethical dimensions of Islam reflect both its historical context and its spiritual goals. While many of its teachings were progressive for their time, they face criticism when measured against contemporary standards of equality and justice. Examining these teachings in context allows for a deeper understanding of their origins and their relevance in the modern world.
If you enjoy our content, we'd love your support. By joining one of our channel memberships, you help us continue creating videos like this one while gaining access to some amazing perks. As a member, you'll unlock exclusive content available only to supporters, earn loyalty badges to show off in comments and live chats, and enjoy priority responses to your comments, shoutouts, and more. The best part? Memberships start at just $2.99 a month, less than a cup of coffee. Even small contributions make a big difference for the PJ Bible TV team in covering production costs and delivering the content you love. And if you're not ready to become a channel member today but still want to support us, there are other ways to help. Engaging with our videos is a tremendous way to show your support. By taking just a few moments to like the video, share it with friends, family, or on social media, and leave a comment, you're telling the YouTube algorithm to share our content with more people. Your support, no matter how you choose to show it, means the world to us. Thank you for being part of the PJ Bible TV community.